It's right afternoon, but I have a third anniversary that's coming up on my reporting efforts today, so I'm going to do that while I'm uploading the other videos to the YouTube site, and then they will be made available as the time becomes relevant. This concerns my efforts to report to the IAEA. My first effort to contact them was under one specific uh, pretense. This was after I'd done everything I could domestically to deal with problems that were accruing. Up to and including what I was concerned was an effort to try to intentionally engage in policy breaches relative to a direct and literal environment as a way to not only habituate peoples to patterns of behavior that tolerated intentional breaches of the policy of concern, but also in connection with derivative concurrent processes to which people were connected, that they were prioritizing and preferencing over the literal environment within which they were. Now, I am I don't know how much on the record you can be with this, but when I was growing up, my father told me about a particular project he worked on while he was in the military. And this project had to do with an understanding of different levels concerning communications, including international communications on satellite networks, that would potentially have a significant variation in what would be allowed as information for public distribution, and that these different communications could be running concurrently. There was a particular manner in which it was referred to. There was a particular name of that project. Now, however, there is a private company attempting to do some sort of satellite communications work that alleges that it is providing a service that's somewhat similar to what he described, but I don't believe it's the same thing. I do believe, however, that what's happened is that there has been an intentional manipulation of what would have been appropriate security protocols, up to and including distinctions. And people who are otherwise qualified to engage in tasks or to engage in processes on one level are intentionally downgraded because the political opportunism has allowed for a form of political corruption to take precedence over actual competence and actual safety in connection with applicable policies and in an intentional effort to undermine national security. I believe ultimately the aim is to destabilize national economies so that there is a process of forced privatization. And this forced privatization is seeking to have access to some of the most high risk sectors outside of any sort of regulatory oversight. And so it is intentionally sabotaging necessary regulatory agencies and is also attempting to create a political sphere where people who might otherwise be qualified or competent to actually engage legitimately in either regulatory processes or production processes or even distribution or maintenance processes connected to assets or connected to projects that are necessarily understood to be high risk and would involve some level of very intense expertise in order to be able to do successfully. That if these people do not cede to prioritizing the political aims of operatives seeking to promote a specific agenda aimed at advantaging them both in terms of access to political capital as well as economic capital, then they will undermine the individuals who are qualified and have instead created an elaborate ruse within the insurance sector to try to offset what are actually acts of industrial sabotage aimed at trying to cow large swaths of people into cooperation with illegal activity. Unfortunately, especially in the United States, after what happened in the last election, I have to say that one of the most stark, right? One of the most stark examples of this is in the form of the legalization of marijuana at a time frame during which the actual economic viability of a legal marijuana economy has yet to actually be discussed as part of the public sector. What has been happening, however, is this paradigm around alleged resiliency that I believe is actually a form of cyber sabotage. I believe that these forms of cyber sabotage are also connected to some form of manipulation of radio frequency that is a form of nuclear warfare. It is akin to the manners in which telecation was first identified as being a part of alleged peaceful atomic energy use in the early days of alleged peaceful atomic energy creation, and what was meant to be a paradigm whereby peaceful uses, or shall we say socially beneficial uses, of the principles and the capacities of atomic energy production were to be made accessible to people. That what ended up happening is political opportunism and political corruption allowed for those to be leveraged, including in very, very extreme manners, in order to compel people to acquiesce to a specific political agenda that lacks a constitutional basis in the proliferation of the constitutional system and is also in violation of international law. Now, as this has been going on, one of the things that I have been attempting to keep track of in the United States is my understanding that what happened at Fukushima, Japan, was actually a terrorist attack. I believe that Fukushima was a premeditated terrorist attack orchestrated primarily by, but not exclusively by, actors in the United States. I believe now, which is different from what I believed when I first started researching it as a potential, in terms of understanding it from a perspective of a terrorist attack, that the primary motive behind Fukushima was twofold. A, it sought to forestall Japan from engaging in relations regarding its own nuclear sector with countries outside of the paternalistic control of the United States, either as an oversight agent or as someone to whom Japan would be economically available for exploitation, as part of, I believe, an effort to continue to place Japan in a specific strategic relationship in regards to the American nuclear sector, specifically the American nuclear weapons sector, as opposed to the nuclear energy sector allegedly being orchestrated or being promulgated under peaceful auspices. One of the examples is, I believe, an intentional effort to attempt to interfere with Japan developing nuclear energy in conjunction with Vietnam. Now, say what you want about the implications, that this was something that I understood the United States was not going to allow to happen. Secondly, there were elements of the Japan nuclear sector that were completely unique to Japan in terms of its development, that honestly, no other country is in a capacity to be able to access, develop, or wield as Japan is. However, there were others around the world that saw that there were specific advantages that they thought they could have for their own sectors or their own people if they were to be able to access elements of the Japan nuclear paradigm without having to apply standards that Japan had set for its own industry or operate within a particular context of what Japan had identified as being what its sector was about. Now, this is something that has been going on for several years and has also been reflected in information about the relationship that Japan and Japanese development sector has to other parts of the world. This understanding that there has been a difference in terms of understanding what standards are in certain sectors in Japan, and that while the quality or the particular manner in which Japan provides is sought after, the particulars around what would be the acceptable standards for production or provision as being expressed by Japan are not as desirable. They want the product and what the product has the potential to be, but they don't want to have to pay or they don't want to have to comply with what Japan understands to be the standards that are needed in order to provide what it is capable of providing. And hence, the decision to attack Fukushima in order to undermine not only the Japanese nuclear sector, but also other elements of Japanese society and the Japanese economy was actually a strategic global terrorist attack. And what I believe has been happening is since then that there has been a type of poaching, a type of theft, specifically from the Japanese sector, that is being attempted for reinculcation or recapitulation in other nuclear paradigms around the world. This is dangerous for a variety of reasons, up to and including the fact that these other places that are expecting to be able to be availed of these aspects of the nuclear sector from Japan have not gone through what Japan has gone through in developing its nuclear paradigm. And without being in a situation of having a particular kind of candor and a particular kind of formal relationship with Japan that acknowledges that certain terms are necessary for a full acknowledgement of the implications, it is intentionally reckless, and it constitutes a form of leveraging that should be globally precluded and considered to be unacceptable. Nobody, including those acting under the auspices that they are supported by the United States, should be allowed to do that. And as an American, I believe it is actually very, very important that the rest of the world understand it on those terms as well, and not allow for people to misrepresent themselves as Americans taking on the helm of, or taking responsibility, or alleging to take responsibility for the American nuclear paradigm under such auspices. My first encounter with this was when I was in a domestic violence shelter, and there was an announcement by the Prime Minister of Japan that the aid to Fukushima was running out. So they were going to be returning people to their housing. But don't worry, the environmental factors have changed. It's not as dangerous as people thought it was. Well, meanwhile, there was a situation ongoing with a negotiation concerning a contract for the provision of uranium to TEPCO that was not viable. The Japanese nuclear sector did not have any way, usefully and safely, to continue purchasing uranium from from Cameco. And yet, it was decided that Japan should still be bound to the terms of the contract to purchase uranium from a company when it did not have a way to safely apply or employ that uranium. I believe this was part of a global speculation that was completely unacceptable. And in the course, what happened is certain decisions were made, and one of the decisions that was made was leveraging the safety of the survivors of the Fukushima disaster, including in terms of where they were going to be physically and spatially and geographically located, under the auspices that there wasn't money. There was no more money in the budget to support the people that were dealing with the nuclear disaster. The truth of the matter is, it was part of a long-term eugenicist program. And insofar as it was part of this long-term eugenicist program that's been intentionally compromising nuclear safety to accomplish its aims, we still to this day have not gotten to the core aspects of what was really going on with Fukushima, and in the process, what else has been revealed. What has been revealed is that there are serious compromises right now going on in the United States around nuclear safety that also should not have been allowed to occur. And as long as there's allowed to be a misrepresentation that Fukushima was merely an accident that was caused without the actual understanding of the precipitating events, which I believe also includes a nuclear attack on Estonia preceding the nuclear attack on Fukushima, then we have a situation where the chain of events that is resulting from that and is continuing to unfold does not have any course correction. We have to acknowledge what actually happened at Fukushima, which then brings up the next issue. What ended up happening with the water? My understanding is that in the fall of 2019, prior to announcements of COVID-19, that Japan had made a declaration, and that TEPCO had said it did not have the capacity to hold millions of gallons of contaminated water, that it had engaged in a decision that at some point in the future, without some intervention or without some acknowledgement and assistance with some alternative arrangement, they were going to have to start dumping the radioactive water that had been accumulating into the ocean. That they did not see or understand they had any other alternatives. Now, If that's actually literally true, that's one question. I am not personally somebody with the kind of practical experience, even though there is literature of early information about anticipated projects regarding nuclear energy that may or may not have something to contribute in terms of a potential alternative to what has been spoken of. But more than that is the very important security elements that are needing to be contended with at this point. Why is it not considered, regardless of whatever else, that a understanding that a nation is saying that they have so much contaminated water that was a result of a nuclear disaster that they're going to have to start dumping it in the ocean, not considered a global priority that allows for the setting aside of any sort of political opportunism that would preclude a concentrated and concerted collective effort to address. I have information that I've acquired in the last 2 years of what were presented publicly as potential paradigms to address Fukushima from a variety of perspectives, including bioremediation, including a form of a particular kind of leaching associated with terraforming. What ended up happening? Where are we on dealing with this? This is a global problem. And if the reason why it has not been addressed is because of manipulation around contracting with the supplier of the uranium, then why are we not talking about what happened when it came to contracts with Cameco? What else has been intentionally obstructed and obscured that is of such profundity that a country that was subjected to a nuclear disaster is not able to get out of its contract that obligates it to purchase uranium when it can't use it? What is supposed to happen with the uranium that Japan is still obligated to purchase? And this is a very serious question. And so this is part of what needs to be addressed right now. With all these other things that are going on, it is important to acknowledge this, especially because tomorrow is February 23rd. And my understanding is that the nation of Japan, which I just found out, I just saw this, just registered within the last 72 hours, actually within the last 24, that on March 23rd of 2021, Japan is going to engage a default action in consideration of tariffs with the United States. In the last 2 years, there's been very little attention paid to the profundity of the retaliatory tariff schemes engaged in conjunction with the United States, including in connection with questionable activities associated with this assessment of countervailing duties and concerning other countries. I am very concerned that attendant with what is acknowledged, at least in the source that I saw within the last 24 hours, as a concurring imposition of another stage of tariffs by the European Union, is a form of non-public and non-explicit nuclear upsmanship. And the question is, how do people like us, people like me, people who otherwise would have been involved in a good faith effort to try to address a de-escalation or a process of remediation, how are we supposed to be protected against the political wrangling that has been going on in this process? If I'm correct, and that what has been happening is a form of what I only know how to identify as sex terrorism, as a means by which to attempt to sabotage different conceptions of nuclear paradigm and or handle the full implications of the nuclear age in a responsible manner, then this is something we have to talk about explicitly. It is not appropriate to attempt to centrally plan the economy for a sublimation of automation that is ultimately not only unsustainable, but is genocidal. Entire cultures are being extincted intentionally right now for particular political agendas that do not even allow for us to have a process where we can address the environmental factors we have to deal with. If somebody is going to try to, as they have in the United States, entertain this notion that nuclear energy is somehow able to be identified as an alternative or a more desirable alternative to fossil fuel extractivist sectors, then attendant with that is going to have to be a specific explication of the totality of the environmental factors of concern. That also means the constraints and the impedances that are presented in the course of our consciousness about how to engage responsibly. I'm really hoping that this time, this effort to follow up is taken seriously. I'm very concerned. It's very difficult when there's so much misinformation being presented publicly under the auspices of this COVID 19 situation, including information that is not permanent. And when I say permanent, the publication in a print publication of an article or a report allows for it to be a permanent record. The internet, as we know, is not as stable as a medium, including in terms of providing information that can actually be able to be cross referenced and be checked up on in order to assure that we're doing what we need to do to respond to things that were identified earlier as potential perils. Now that we have been in a great part of the world, and at least in the United States, mostly confined to having to deal with things through the interfaces of electronics, it is very easy for somebody else to remotely manipulate information and to mischaracterize and misrepresent what is accurate information about the situation. It's difficult for me, for instance, to feel confident that, especially if we were talking about situations connected to the disaster or the implications of what is ongoing connected to the disaster at Fukushima, that what I would find online would be more than an attempt to influence a quantum concurrent process, as I believe was actually being intentionally speculated on at the beginning of 2018. That rather what we need is to be able to cross-reference and to be able to double check those records and make sure that we're actually meeting the responsibilities we need, including in connection with things that were already identified and that were already understood to be in need of addressing in the moment. Defaulting on a timeline connected to nuclear safety, especially if it was intentionally done, has far-reaching consequences. But it's no reason to withdraw or retract oneself from the process of continuing to be diligent in doing what is necessary to be apprised of the full spectrum of the matter at hand. I never wanted to be involved with anything at this level. But it seems that I have been for a very long time anyway. It doesn't make any useful sense to try to obstruct or occlude someone more than capable of being responsible, especially when there's so much legacy already just with that one person in terms of all these other matters of concern. So I'm hoping that this time this message reaches who it needs to in order for there to actually be a response.